Welcome back. Have you ever looked at a modern map of the world and uh, just wondered, why are the borders drawn exactly there?
Yeah, or why certain countries have these really deep historical grievances that, still dominate our news feeds today.
Exactly. Well, today we're taking you back to a singular moment in time where the globe was, quite literally carved up by a few men sitting in a room. We're talking about the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 to 1920.
It genuinely serves as the ultimate origin story for the 20th century. We're drawing today on an incredibly detailed historical overview of the conference. And the sheer volume of cascading consequences that came out of these meetings is just truly unprecedented.
Yeah, it really is.
Everything from the rise of totalitarianism to the borders of the Middle East traces right back to these specific negotiations.
Right. So our mission for you today on this deep dive is to explore how this conference ended World War I, but simultaneously, through its compromises, its bitter grudges, and its, frankly, profound blind spots, planted the seeds for World War II and a century of geopolitical tension. Okay, let's unpack this. Setting the scene, you have the victorious Allies descending on Paris to dictate the terms of peace to the defeated Central Powers.
Right.
The source describes the scale of this event as almost incomprehensible. What did Paris actually look like during those months?
It effectively became the center of a world government. You had diplomats from 32 different countries and nationalities pouring into the city.
Wow.
The logistical footprint was enormous. They established 52 separate commissions. They held over 1,600 sessions, pulling in experts to draft reports on everything imaginable. From the fate of prisoners of war to the regulation of international aviation and even the ownership of undersea cables.
It's wild.
Yeah, for a brief moment, every global issue was just being funneled directly through Paris.
But the source makes a very sharp distinction between that sprawling bureaucracy and where the actual power resided, right?
Oh, absolutely. That entire apparatus was essentially a facade. Despite the 32 countries present, the globe was being dictated to by the Big Four.
And that's the U.S., Britain, France, and Italy.
Correct. Specifically, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, and Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Emanuele Orlando. These four men, along with a tight circle of advisors, met informally 145 times.
Behind closed doors.
Behind closed doors. They made all the major decisions themselves, and then those decisions were just rolled out to be ratified by the rest of the attendees. And the defeated nations, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, they were simply not permitted a voice in the deliberations.
Which is a huge detail. I was reading the section detailing how the conference officially kicked off, and it mentioned a very specific date and location chosen by the French. The conference formally opened on January 18, 1919, and the eventual signing of the treaty with Germany happened in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. Why was the French delegation so insistent on those exact details?
Well, it was a highly calculated move to humiliate Germany.
Which is a massive slip.
A total flex.
Right.
January 18th was the exact anniversary of the proclamation of the German Empire back in 1871, which, if you remember, occurred after France was defeated in the Franco-Prussian War.
Right.
And that 1871 proclamation took place in that very same room, the Hall of Mirrors. So the French wanted to dismantle the German Empire in the exact physical space where it was born.
That is so deeply petty, but also rooted in real trauma, I imagine.
Exactly, trauma and a desperate desire for security. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau had personally witnessed 2 German invasions of French soil in his lifetime. So his primary objective was to weaken Germany militarily, strategically, and economically so they could just never mount another invasion.
That punitive approach seemed to directly clash with the American delegation's agenda. President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Europe as the first sitting U.S. president to ever visit the continent, and he brought his famous 14 points with him.
Right, and Wilson was pushing a document bursting with idealism. He advocated for open diplomacy, free trade, national self-determination. He really wanted to construct a liberal world order governed by international law.
But the Europeans weren't having it.
Not at all. The European powers, who had bled for 4 years in the trenches, were looking for tangible revenge and hard territorial guarantees. They viewed Wilson as this academic who was just totally disconnected from the brutal realities of European geopolitics.
Which perfectly sets up my favorite quote from the source material. Clemenceau was so frustrated with Wilson's moralizing that he famously complained, Mr. Wilson bores me with his 14 points. Why God Almighty has only 10.
It's a great line. And that friction dominated the room, and it ultimately produced the Treaty of Versailles, the most famous of the 5 major treaties drafted at the conference. The centerpiece of that treaty was the notorious Article 231.
The War Guilt Clause.
Exactly. Article 231 legally placed the entire liability for the war and all the subsequent damages squarely on the aggression of Germany and her allies.
Beyond just being a profound insult to the German public, what was the practical function of that clause?
It served as the legal foundation required to impose crippling financial reparations on Germany. The Allies needed a legal justification to demand that Germany pay for the pensions of Allied soldiers and the rebuilding of European infrastructure.
So it was about the money.
Yes, and it created an impossible financial burden. It was a debt Germany was supposed to pay, but essentially defaulted on by 1931, which fueled deep domestic resentment.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I noticed a detail in the source about some backdoor maneuvering by the French that happened completely out of sight of the public, and even out of sight of their own allies. What was the René Massigli mission?
This is a wild detail. France was so deeply paranoid about their security in the post-war world that they sent a diplomat, René Massigli, on a secret mission to Berlin.
Just totally bypassing the Americans and the British.
Entirely behind their backs. Massigli approached the German government and proposed that France and Germany actually shared a common enemy, the Anglo-Saxon powers, meaning the U.S. and Britain.
Unbelievable.
Right. France offered to revise the harsh territorial and economic clauses of the upcoming peace treaty if Germany would agree to form a joint alliance with France to counter American and British global domination.
To think that France was trying to ally with Germany against the U.S. and Britain before the ink was even dry on the treaty is just a crazy historical footnote. Why didn't Germany take the deal?
Well, the German foreign minister suspected it was a trap. He thought it was designed to trick them into accepting the harsh treaty terms. Ironically, the German leadership also calculated that Woodrow Wilson was more likely to offer them lenient terms than the French were, so they gambled on American idealism over French realpolitik.
And lost that gamble, ultimately.
Yeah.
But France wasn't the only Allied power feeling deeply insecure about the outcome. The Italian delegation seemed to be fighting an uphill battle from the moment they arrived.
True. Italy had joined the Allied war effort in 1915 specifically because they were promised significant territorial expansions in a secret agreement called the Treaty of London.
Right.
They were promised control over the Adriatic Sea, including the Dalmatian coast, parts of the Tyrol, and Trieste. But at the conference, Italian Prime Minister Orlando struggled to advocate for his country. For one, he couldn't speak English, so he relied heavily on his foreign minister to negotiate, and the other powers pushed back hard against giving Italy the city of Fiume.
The source mentions that Italy lost 700,000 soldiers in the war, and their economy was devastated. When Orlando returned home without those promised territories, how did the Italian public react?
It sparked a national crisis. Italian nationalists coined a term for the outcome, a mutilated victory.
Mutilated victory, that's a heavy phrase.
It really is. That intense feeling of betrayal and national humiliation became the direct fuel for the rise of Italian fascism. The disappointment in Paris provided the perfect populist talking point for Benito Mussolini to rally a fractured nation.
Now, the diplomatic tension wasn't just occurring between the different empires, it was also fracturing the empires internally. Britain attempted to speak for its entire global empire at the conference, but the dominions, countries like Canada and Australia, demanded their own distinct seats at the table.
Yes, they felt they had earned the right to sovereign representation through their immense sacrifices on the battlefield.
Could you break down the numbers the source provides regarding Canada's contribution? It really puts their demands into perspective.
Sure. Canadian Prime Minister Robert Borden pointed out that Canada had lost 60,000 men in the conflict. To put that in context, that was a larger raw number than the 50,000 military deaths suffered by the United States.
That is staggering.
It is. Borden argued that Canada had bled as much as anyone and demanded representation as a minor power. Eventually, Britain and a reluctant Woodrow Wilson had to concede.
But the fiercest internal clash came from the Australian Prime Minister, Billy Hughes. He clashed relentlessly with Wilson over the fate of German colonies in the Pacific, which Australia wanted to absorb as a buffer zone against future threats. There was an incredible exchange detailed in the text where Wilson, growing annoyed with Australian demands, dismissively says to Hughes, "But after all, you speak for only 5 million people."
And Hughes fired back immediately, "I represent 60,000 dead." It perfectly captures the raw grief and nationalism sitting just beneath the bureaucratic arguments. Hughes was fighting ferociously for Australian interests, which brings us to one of the most pivotal and tragic moments of the entire conference. What's fascinating here is the role of the Japanese delegation and their specific demands.
Right, because Japan was originally considered one of the leading powers at the start of the conference.
Right.
What were they trying to achieve in the new League of Nations?
They had a sizable delegation headed by a former prime minister, and alongside territorial claims, they proposed a racial equality clause to be included in the covenant of the newly formed League of Nations.
Okay.
It was a straightforward amendment stating that all alien nationals of League member states should receive equal and just treatment, making no distinction on account of their race or nationality.
On the surface, that aligns perfectly with Woodrow Wilson's rhetoric about a liberal, equitable world order. Why did it face such fierce opposition?
Because it hit a brick wall built by the colonial powers. While the British delegation was theoretically open to it on a nominal level, they faced intense pressure from their dominions. Australia, led by Billy Hughes, and South Africa were deeply opposed to the clause because it fundamentally threatened their own restrictive, race-based immigration policies.
Ah, I see.
To keep the British Empire united, Britain abstained from supporting the Japanese proposal.
But the proposal still went to a vote among the delegates. If the majority supported it, how did Woodrow Wilson manage to kill the amendment?
Wilson was facing his own domestic pressures from a segregated America, and as the chairman of the conference, he utilized a procedural loophole. Even though 11 of the 17 delegates voted in favor of the racial equality proposal, Wilson suddenly ruled that a unanimous vote was required for it to pass.
A completely arbitrary ruling just to bury the clause.
Precisely. And the diplomatic fallout was monumental. This public, humiliating rejection deeply alienated the Japanese delegation. The source explicitly links the defeat of this proposal to Japan's subsequent turn away from diplomatic cooperation with the Western world.
Pushing them toward the nationalist and militarist policies that would lead directly to World War II.
Exactly. And Japan wasn't the only Asian nation leaving Paris deeply disillusioned. The Chinese delegation, led by Liu Zhenxiang, demanded that former German concessions in the Shantung province be returned to Chinese sovereignty.
But despite the Western powers preaching the gospel of self-determination, they opted to hand those Chinese territories over to Japan.
Yes, essentially to appease Japanese territorial demands after killing their equality clause. The hypocrisy was glaring.
It sparked the massive May 4th student protests across China. The Chinese delegation was so furious over the betrayal that they became the only delegation at the conference to flat-out refuse to sign the Treaty of Versailles.
Which raises an important question. Who else was being locked out while the map was being redrawn? Because the silence in that room was just as influential as the arguments.
That's a great point. As you listen to this, you really have to consider that what did not happen in Paris shaped our modern world just as much as what did. The halls were full of delegations that the Big Four actively ignored. You had Korean nationalists traveling from Hawaii and China trying to secure a hearing for independence from Japanese rule. They were ignored.
Right.
You had the first Pan-African Congress, supported by W.E.B. Du Bois, petitioning to turn Germany's African colonies over to an international organization rather than handing them to new colonial masters.
Yeah.
They were ignored. There was even a young man named Nguyen Ai Quoc petitioning for the self-determination of the Vietnamese people against French colonial rule.
But because Vietnam was a French colony, the great powers refused to even entertain his petition. That young man, radicalized by the rejection of Western democratic processes, later became known to the world as Ho Chi Minh.
But perhaps the most devastating tragedy detailed in the source material revolves around Iran, which was officially known as Persia at the time. Can you explain what happened to the Iranian people during the war?
The Iranian delegation's experience is a grim lesson in great power politics. Iran had declared strict neutrality during World War I. However, their geographic location made them a battleground. Their territory was repeatedly violated and occupied by British, Russian, and Ottoman forces.
Just caught in the crossfire.
Completely. These foreign armies requisitioned local food supplies, which led to a catastrophic economic collapse and a horrific famine. The source cites estimates that as many as 8 to 10 million Iranians died from starvation or disease brought on by malnutrition.
8 to 10 million.
Yes, that was nearly half of the country's population at the time.
So with millions of dead civilians and their neutrality violated, the Iranian delegation travels to Paris. They demand the evacuation of foreign troops, reparations for wartime damages, and a restoration of their sovereignty. Why were they refused admittance to the main sessions?
The opposition came largely from Britain. Acknowledging Iran's rights conflicted directly with British strategic interests. Britain wanted to secure access to Iranian oil and protect the geographic routes leading to their colonial crown jewel, India.
Unbelievable.
Shortly after the conference, Britain actually attempted to push through the Anglo-Persian Agreement of 1919, which would have effectively turned Iran into a British protectorate. So Iran's voice was silenced simply to protect imperial access to resources.
We see a very similar dynamic play out in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire had collapsed, and its vast territories were being carved up. How did the League of Nations handle the Arab provinces?
They utilized a system called mandates. Rather than granting independence to these regions, the League of Nations effectively assigned control over the Arab provinces to Britain and France. They drew borders, creating new entities like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, placing them under the administrative control of London and Paris.
And the text points out that this was not done in ignorance of local desires. The conference heard competing claims from Zionist representatives who submitted draft resolutions for a Jewish homeland under a British mandate, and from Arab leaders advocating for regional independence. To figure out what the locals actually wanted, Woodrow Wilson pushed for an international commission of inquiry.
Yes. Britain and France initially agreed to participate in that inquiry, but quickly backed out when they realized it might threaten their colonial ambitions.
Of course.
So it proceeded as a purely American effort known as the King-Crane Commission. They toured the region, took statements, and sampled public opinion regarding the future of Syria and Palestine.
What happened to the King-Crane Commission's report once it was finished?
It was buried. The findings indicated strong local opposition to French mandates and a deep desire for independence, because that conflicted with the secret deals the great powers had already made.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Exactly, which was a backdoor deal made years earlier by Britain and France to divide the Arab world between themselves. So the report was kept entirely secret. It wasn't published until the New York Times broke the story years later in December 1922. The great powers simply proceeded with their imperial divisions regardless of the Commission's findings.
We've been talking a lot about geographical nations being locked out of the negotiations, Iran, Vietnam, China. But there was an entire demographic spanning all of these nations that was also barred from the table. Women were entirely denied seats at the main negotiating table.
Yes, they were.
But a committee organized an Inter-Allied Women's Conference right there in Paris. How did they manage to force their way into the conversation?
They were led by Marguerite de Witt-Schellenberger, the president of the French Union for Women's Suffrage. They basically refused to be sidelined by the male diplomats. They relentlessly lobbied Wilson and the other delegates, and they successfully demanded a hearing before the League of Nations Commission.
And their lobbying actually secured a tangible victory in the final text.
They did. They forced a concrete addition into the final framework, Article 7 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. It explicitly mandated that all positions under or in connection with the League, including the Secretariat, shall be open equally to men and women.
That's amazing.
They managed to enshrine women's professional rights into the literal blueprint of the new international governing body.
So what does this all mean? When historians look back at this chaotic, multi-year process of secret deals, ignored petitions, and the carving up of empires, how do they assess what the Big Four were actually trying to accomplish?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the analysis provided by historians like Eric Hobsbawm and John Lewis Gaddis. We often view Woodrow Wilson's push for self-determination, the idea that distinct ethnic groups should have their own sovereign nations, as pure, naive idealism. But these historians argue it was actually a highly calculated strategic maneuver against the Bolsheviks in Russia.
Because the Russian Revolution had just occurred, and the Bolsheviks were actively calling for a global workers' uprising.
Exactly. That terrified the capitalist powers sitting in Paris. Historians argue that Wilson played the nationalist card to tame that revolutionary fever. By creating a whole new block of small nation-states in Eastern Europe, countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic states, the Allies were intentionally building a quarantine belt.
A quarantine belt.
Yes. It was a strategic barrier designed to stop the spread of the Russian Bolshevik Revolution from sweeping westward into a devastated and vulnerable Germany.
But the source points out a deeply troubling downside to this obsession with drawing neat national borders based on ethnicity. What happens when you try to apply the concept of a pure nation-state to a map where populations are incredibly mixed?
This is where Hobsbawm's observation is grim, but entirely necessary to understand. He points out that the logical conclusion of trying to create a map neatly divided into territorial states where each state is inhabited by a separate, ethnically and linguistically homogeneous population is inherently violent. The only way to actually achieve that perfect homogeneity in the real world is through the mass expulsion or extermination of minorities. When you make ethnicity the core basis of a state's legitimacy, anyone who doesn't fit that specific ethnic definition becomes a problem to be solved.
Because the real world isn't neatly divided.
Precisely. Hobsbawm notes that the terrifying reality of this ethno-nationalism wouldn't be fully demonstrated until the 1940s. The peacemakers in Paris, in their attempt to solve the political problems of 1919 and quarantine the Bolsheviks, were inadvertently laying the philosophical and geographical groundwork for the atrocities of the Second World War.
As you listen to this, think about the immense value of dissecting this specific moment in time. The borders of Eastern Europe, the global tensions in the Pacific, the very concept of an international governing body. All of it traces its messy, complicated, often hypocritical origins right back to these specific rooms in Paris. The world we navigate today was sketched out on their drafting tables.
And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, specifically regarding the League of Nations itself. Think about it. President Woodrow Wilson sacrificed many of his core ideals at this conference, making compromise after compromise, just to ensure his ultimate dream, the League of Nations, was actually created.
Yeah.
Yet, because of domestic isolationist pushback back home, the United States never ratified the Treaty of Versailles and never even joined the League. Imagine how differently the chaotic 20th century might have unfolded if the primary architect of the New World Order had actually taken a seat at the table he built.
An incredible lens through which to view the modern world. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Paris Peace Conference. We'll see you next time.